I trusted her with the darkest corners of my soul, and she used every single secret I ever told her to systematically destroy my life. That is not something you ever expect from the person you pay to help you heal. That is not something you imagine when you sit on a leather couch in a softly lit office with tissues within arm's reach and a woman across from you nodding gently, telling you that this is a safe space, that everything you share will stay between these walls, that she is here to help you rebuild yourself after everything has fallen apart. I believed every word she said. I trusted her completely, and she turned that trust into a weapon she used against me in ways I still have nightmares about to this day. My name is Megan, and 3 years ago, I walked into the office of Dr. Carolyn Vance because my marriage had just collapsed. My sense of self had shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I needed someone, anyone, to help me understand why my life had gone so wrong. I was 31 years old, a corporate lawyer at one of Boston's most prestigious firms, and I thought I had everything figured out. I had worked my entire life to build something stable, something secure. I grew up watching my parents struggle financially, watching my mother work double shifts as a nurse while my father bounced between construction jobs that never seemed to last. I swore to myself that I would never live like that. I would never feel that instability, that constant anxiety about whether the rent would get paid or whether we could afford groceries that week. So I studied harder than anyone else. I got scholarships. I went to law school. I landed a job that paid more money than my parents had ever seen in their lives. And I married Daniel, a man I met at a networking event, an investment banker with a charming smile and a way of making me feel like I was the most important person in any room. For 5 years, I thought I was living the dream. We had a beautiful apartment in Back Bay. We took vacations to Europe. We talked about having children someday, about buying a house in the suburbs with a big backyard where kids could play. I thought Daniel loved me the way I loved him. I thought we were building something real together. But then I discovered the affair. I discovered that for at least 2 years of our marriage, he had been sleeping with a woman from his office, a junior analyst named Brittany, who was barely 25 years old. I found the texts on his phone one night when he left it charging in the kitchen while he showered. I was not looking for anything. I just saw a message pop up on the screen, a message with a heart emoji and words that made my stomach turn inside out. And when I scrolled through their conversation, I found months of evidence, years of lies, a whole secret relationship that had been happening while I slept next to him every night, believing he was faithful, believing our marriage meant something. The divorce was brutal. Daniel was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. He hired the most aggressive attorney in the city and tried to claim that I was the one who had been emotionally distant, that I had driven him away with my workaholic tendencies, that I was the reason the marriage failed. He even tried to hide assets, to undervalue his investments, to claim that certain accounts were business expenses rather than marital property. I had to fight for every single thing I was entitled to, and by the time it was over, I was exhausted in ways I had never experienced before. I won the settlement. I got the apartment. I got a fair share of our joint assets. But I lost something more important. I lost my ability to trust anyone. I lost my belief that I could read people, that I could protect myself from being hurt. I felt like a fool who had missed all the signs, who had believed every lie, who had built a life on a foundation that had been rotting the entire time. That was the state I was in when I found Dr. Carolyn Vance. My friend Rachel had been the one to suggest therapy. Rachel and I had been close since law school, and she was one of the few people I could be completely honest with during the divorce. She watched me fall apart, watched me stop eating, watched me cry in her kitchen at 2 a.m. because I could not understand how I had missed so much. She was the one who finally said, "Megan, I think you need to talk to someone professional, someone who can help you work through this in a way that I cannot. And because I trusted Rachel with my life, I listened to her advice. I researched therapists in the Boston area for weeks. I read reviews online. I looked at credentials and specializations. I wanted someone who focused on trauma, on betrayal, on helping people rebuild after their lives had been shattered. Dr. Carolyn Vance had a website that seemed perfect. She specialized in helping clients recover from infidelity and divorce. She had been practicing for over 15 years. She had glowing testimonials from former patients who described her as warm, insightful, and genuinely caring. Her office was in a beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, the kind of building that suggested success and competence. When I called to schedule my first appointment, the receptionist was friendly and professional. Everything about the experience suggested that I was in good hands. I still remember walking into her office for the first time. The waiting room was decorated in soft earth tones, with plants in the corners and a small fountain that created a gentle background noise. There were magazines on the table, but not the usual gossip rags you see in doctors' offices. These were journals about wellness, about mindfulness, about personal growth. Everything was designed to make you feel calm and safe. And when Caroline came out to greet me, she smiled in a way that seemed genuinely warm. She was an attractive woman in her early 40s, with auburn hair that fell just past her shoulders and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She was dressed professionally but not coldly, in a soft blue sweater and simple jewelry. She shook my hand and said, "You must be Megan. I am so glad you reached out. Please come on in." Her office was even more carefully designed than the waiting room. There was a leather couch where clients sat, positioned across from a comfortable armchair where she would sit with a notepad on her lap. There were bookshelves lined with psychology texts and personal development guides. There was soft lighting and a window that looked out onto a quiet courtyard. Everything about the space was meant to lower your defenses, to make you feel safe enough to share your deepest wounds. And that first session, I did exactly that. Caroline asked me open-ended questions that helped me start talking about the divorce, about Daniel's affair, about the sense of betrayal that I could not seem to shake. She listened without judgment. She nodded in all the right places. She said things like, "That must have been incredibly painful for you, and it is completely understandable that you are struggling to trust again." By the end of that first hour, I felt like I had finally found someone who understood what I was going through. Over the next few months, I began to open up to Caroline in ways I had never opened up to anyone before. I told her about my childhood, about the financial instability that had shaped so much of my personality. I told her about my deepest fears, about the part of me that worried I was fundamentally unlovable, that there was something wrong with me that made Daniel seek comfort elsewhere. I told her about my insecurities at work, about the imposter syndrome that plagued me despite all my professional success. I told her about my strained relationship with my mother, who had never really approved of my choices and who I sometimes feared would never truly respect me. I told her things I had never told Rachel, things I had never admitted out loud to anyone, because that is what therapy is supposed to be, a sacred space where you can be completely honest without fear of judgment or consequence. Carolyn seemed like the perfect therapist. She remembered details from our previous sessions. She asked follow-up questions that showed she was genuinely engaged with my story. She offered insights that helped me see patterns in my behavior that I had never noticed before. She suggested coping strategies for my anxiety, breathing exercises I could do when I felt overwhelmed, journaling prompts that helped me process my emotions. After 6 months of seeing her every week, I felt like I was finally starting to heal. I was sleeping better. I was eating regularly again. I was able to go to work without feeling like I was going to break down at any moment. I even started tentatively dating again. Nothing serious, just coffee with a few men I had matched with on apps. just to prove to myself that I could still put myself out there. It was around this time that Caroline started doing something that I did not recognize as a red flag at the time. She started sharing more about her own life. In therapy, this is called self-disclosure, and it is something that therapists are supposed to use very sparingly and only when it genuinely serves the client's treatment. But Caroline started telling me about her own experiences in ways that felt more personal than professional. She mentioned her own divorce several years earlier. She talked about how she understood what I was going through because she had been there herself. She complained about challenges in her personal life, about feeling lonely, about struggling to maintain friendships as she got older. At the time, I thought this was a sign that she genuinely cared about me, that our relationship was evolving into something deeper than just a clinical arrangement. I felt special because she was sharing things with me that I assumed she did not share with all her clients. I did not realize that she was deliberately blurring the boundaries between us, that she was building a false sense of intimacy that she would later exploit. The first real sign that something was wrong came about 8 months into our therapeutic relationship. I had mentioned to Caroline in one of our sessions that I was considering applying for a partner position at my law firm. It was a huge opportunity, one that would significantly increase my salary and my standing in the legal community. But I was nervous about it. I was not sure I was ready. I worried that the partners would not see me as leadership material, especially given the emotional turmoil I had been going through with the divorce. Caroline encouraged me to apply. She said I was more than qualified and that I should not let self-doubt hold me back from pursuing what I deserved. 2 weeks later, I ran into a woman named Samantha Chen at a legal networking event. Samantha was a lawyer at a competing firm, someone I knew casually from bar association functions. We were making small talk when she said something that made my blood run cold. She said, "I heard you are going for partner at your firm. That is a big step, especially after everything you went through with your divorce. It must have been hard dealing with your ex-husband's affair while trying to maintain your professional reputation." I felt my face go pale. I had not told anyone at work about the affair. I had carefully compartmentalized my personal life and my professional life. The only person I had discussed the details of my divorce with, outside of Rachel and my divorce attorney, was Carolyn. I asked Samantha how she had heard about any of this. Trying to keep my voice steady, she looked uncomfortable and said, "Oh, I am sorry. I thought it was common knowledge. Someone mentioned it at a cocktail party a few weeks ago. I do not remember who exactly. I probably should not have said anything." I spent the rest of that event in a haze of confusion and growing dread. How had information about my personal life made its way into professional gossip circles? The only explanation I could think of was that my divorce attorney had mentioned something to someone, which would have been a serious breach of attorney-client privilege. But that did not feel right. My attorney was a meticulous professional who would never risk her reputation by gossiping about client cases. The alternative explanation, that Caroline had shared information about me with someone outside our sessions, seemed impossible. Therapists are bound by strict confidentiality rules. Everything I told her was protected by law. She could not share details of my treatment with anyone without my explicit consent. At least, that was what I believed at the time. I decided to ask Caroline about it directly in our next session. I told her about my conversation with Samantha, about how someone had apparently been discussing my divorce at a cocktail party. I asked if there was any way that information could have leaked from her office. Caroline's reaction was immediate and convincing. She looked genuinely concerned and said, "Megan, I want you to know that everything you share with me is completely confidential. I have never discussed your case with anyone. I take privacy very seriously, and I would never breach your trust that way." She suggested that perhaps someone from my divorce proceedings had talked, or maybe Someone at my firm had pieced things together from public records. Divorce filings are often a matter of public record, she reminded me, and sometimes people go looking for information about their colleagues. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. So I accepted her explanation and tried to put the incident out of my mind. But over the next few weeks, more strange things started happening. I received a phone call from a reporter at a local business magazine who was writing a story about women in corporate law. She wanted to interview me, which was flattering. But during our conversation, she asked questions that felt oddly personal. She asked about work-life balance, about how I managed stress, about whether I had ever sought professional help for the pressures of my career. The questions were not inappropriate on their face, but they felt targeted, as if she already knew things about me that she should not have known. I declined to be interviewed and hung up, feeling unsettled. Then, a few days later, I noticed that a colleague at my firm, a woman named Patricia, who had always been friendly with me, suddenly seemed cold and distant. She avoided making eye contact with me in meetings. She stopped inviting me to lunch with the group. When I finally confronted her and asked if something was wrong, she hesitated before saying, "Look, Megan, I do not want to get involved in drama, but some people have been talking, and there are concerns about whether you are really stable enough for a partnership. Maybe you should address those concerns before they become a bigger problem." I pressed her for more details, but she refused to say anything else. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. It seemed like everywhere I turned, people knew things about me that they should not have known. Intimate details about my emotional state, about my therapy, about my struggles with the divorce. But I still could not figure out how this information was getting out. I started to become paranoid, wondering if my phone was being tapped, if someone was reading my emails, if there was some kind of surveillance going on that I was not aware of. I even hired a tech consultant to sweep my apartment and my devices for spyware, but they found nothing. I was grasping at straws, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Through all of this, I continued seeing Caroline for therapy. I told her about my growing anxiety, about my feeling that someone was sabotaging my professional reputation. She listened with what seemed like genuine concern and offered suggestions for managing my stress. She recommended that I take some time off work to focus on my mental health. She suggested that maybe I was becoming a bit paranoid, that the stress of the divorce and the partnership application was causing me to see conspiracies where none existed. She encouraged me to consider medication, perhaps an anti-anxiety prescription that could help take the edge off. At the time, I thought she was trying to help me. I did not realize that she was gaslighting me, making me doubt my own perceptions, making me feel like I was the crazy one when in reality, she was the source of all my problems. The truth started to emerge because of Rachel. My best friend Rachel had always been protective of me, and she had noticed that things in my life seemed to be spiraling in ways that did not make sense. She was a journalist by profession, someone who investigated stories for a living, and she had a natural instinct for recognizing when something was not right. One evening, we were having dinner at her apartment, and I was telling her about the latest strange incident. A potential client at work had mentioned something about my mental health during a meeting, something they could not possibly have known unless someone had told them. Rachel listened carefully, and then she said something that changed everything. She said, "Megan, have you considered that the leak might be coming from your therapist?" I immediately dismissed the idea. I said, "That is impossible. Caroline is bound by confidentiality. She cannot share anything about my treatment without my consent. It would be illegal." But Rachel pushed back. She said, "I know that is the rule, but rules get broken all the time. You have told me that Caroline knows more about your life than anyone else. She knows about the affair, about your insecurities, about your fears at work, and all this information that is leaking out there. It is exactly the kind of stuff you have been sharing with her. What if she is the source?" I wanted to argue with Rachel. wanted to defend Caroline, but something in my gut told me to listen. Rachel suggested that we do a simple test. She said, "In your next therapy session, tell Caroline something that is not true. Make up a story, something specific and unusual that no one else would know. And then let us see if that information makes its way back to you through other channels. If it does, we will know for sure that she is the leak." It felt manipulative, setting a trap for my own therapist, but I was desperate for answers. So in my next session with Carolyn, I lied. I told her that I had been secretly meeting with a headhunter about a job opportunity at a rival firm in New York. I said that I was seriously considering leaving Boston entirely and starting over somewhere new. I described the job in detail, made up the name of the firm, invented conversations I had supposedly had with the recruiters. I made the story convincing enough that Caroline believed every word. She even offered advice about whether relocating would be good for my mental health, suggested that a fresh start might be exactly what I needed. I left that session feeling sick to my stomach, both from the deception and from the growing fear that my suspicions might be correct. 3 days later, Patricia from my office pulled me aside and said, "I heard you were thinking about leaving for a firm in New York. Is that true? Are you really going to abandon your partnership track here?" My blood went cold. There was no job in New York. There was no headhunter. The only person I had told that story to was Carolyn. And now Patricia knew about it, which meant it had spread through the professional grapevine in less than a week. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. My therapist, the woman I had trusted with my deepest secrets, was betraying my confidence. She was sharing my private information with people in my professional circle, and I had no idea why. I called Rachel immediately and told her what had happened. She was not surprised. She said, "I knew it. I knew something was wrong. But Megan, this is serious. What she is doing is not just unethical, it is illegal. Therapists can lose their licenses for this kind of breach. We need to figure out why she is doing it and who she is sharing information with." Rachel immediately went into investigative mode. She started looking into Caroline's background, her professional history, her personal life. She searched public records, social media profiles, anything that might give us a clue about what was motivating this betrayal. What she found shocked us both. Rachel discovered that Caroline was connected to my ex-husband Daniel through a web of social relationships that I had never known about. Daniel's current girlfriend, Brittany, the woman he had cheated on me with, had a sister named Vanessa who worked in real estate. And Vanessa was married to a man named Gregory who played golf regularly at the same country club where Caroline was a member. Rachel found photos on social media of Caroline at club events, standing in groups that included Gregory and, on several occasions, Daniel himself. They were not close friends necessarily, but they ran in the same social circles. They knew each other, and that meant there was a channel through which information could flow from my therapist to my ex-husband. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Daniel was still trying to hurt me. Even though the divorce was finalized, even though he had no legal claim on my life anymore, he was using my own therapist to undermine me professionally and personally. He must have discovered that I was seeing Caroline, maybe through gossip, in their shared social circle, or maybe he had specifically sought out a therapist who would be willing to share information with him. I did not know the exact mechanism yet, but I knew the result. My most intimate secrets were being used as weapons against me by the man who had already betrayed me in the worst possible way. I wanted to confront Caroline immediately, to scream at her, to demand an explanation. But Rachel stopped me. She said, "If you confront her now, she will just deny everything. You need proof. You need evidence that she has been sharing your information and that she has been doing it deliberately. Otherwise, it is your word against hers, and she is a licensed professional with 15 years of practice. No one is going to believe you without evidence. Rachel was right. I had to be strategic. I had to build a case before I made any accusations. And that meant I had to keep seeing Caroline, keep pretending that I trusted her, while secretly documenting everything. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Every session with Caroline felt like sitting across from an enemy who was pretending to be my friend. I had to control my facial expressions, manage my tone of voice, pretend that I did not know what she was doing to me. I had to share fake information, carefully constructed lies that Rachel and I designed to be traceable, things that would prove Caroline was the leak when they inevitably spread through my social and professional networks. We kept a detailed log of every lie I told her, every piece of false information I planted, along with the dates of each session, and we waited to see what would come back to us. Within 2 weeks, we had confirmation of 3 separate leaks. The fake New York job offer that Patricia had mentioned, a fictional relationship I had supposedly started with a man named Tyler, a complete invention who did not exist, but whose name started appearing in gossip among mutual acquaintances, and a made-up health scare, a story I told Caroline about a suspicious mole I had found, which somehow made its way to a woman in my fitness class, who asked me how my biopsy results had turned out. Every single lie I told Caroline in therapy found its way back to me through other people. The evidence was undeniable, but I needed to understand the full scope of what Caroline was doing. I needed to know if she was just gossiping carelessly or if she was deliberately passing information to Daniel. I needed to know if there was a financial arrangement, some kind of payment or benefit she was receiving in exchange for betraying me. And I needed to know how long this had been going on, whether she had been sabotaging me from the very beginning or whether something had changed along the way. To answer these questions, Rachel suggested we hire a professional investigator. His name was Marcus Webb, a private detective who had spent 20 years as a police officer before retiring and starting his own firm. Rachel had used him as a source for stories in the past and vouched for his discretion and competence. When I met with Marcus for the first time, I was nervous about laying out all my suspicions. It felt paranoid to suggest that my therapist was conspiring with my ex-husband to destroy my life. But Marcus listened carefully, took notes, and did not seem skeptical at all. He said, "You would be surprised how often something like this happens. People assume that professional ethics will protect them, but the truth is everyone has a price. If your ex-husband wanted to use your therapist as a source of intelligence, and he found someone willing to play along, it would not be that hard to set up. Let me look into her finances, her communications, her relationships. If there is a connection, I will find it." Marcus went to work, and the results came faster than I expected. Within a week, he had discovered that Caroline had received several large payments over the past year from a company called Beacon Consulting, LLC. The payments were disguised as consulting fees, but when Marcus dug deeper, he found that Beacon Consulting was a shell company with no real business operations. Its registered agent was a lawyer who had also done work for Daniel's investment firm. The trail was not perfectly direct, but it was damning. Daniel had set up a shell company to pay Caroline for information about me. He had been funding her betrayal, buying access to my secrets for what appeared to be several $1,000s per month. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This was not casual gossip or careless boundary violations. This was a calculated, ongoing operation to destroy my professional reputation and my mental health. Daniel wanted me to fail at work. He wanted me to lose the partnership. He wanted me to doubt my own sanity. And he had found a willing accomplice in the woman I trusted to help me heal. The betrayal by Daniel had been devastating enough, but the betrayal by Caroline felt even worse in some ways. She was supposed to protect me. She had taken an oath, made a professional commitment to do no harm, and instead, She had sold me out for money, had used every secret I ever told her as currency to line her own pockets. I spent a lot of sleepless nights during this period, lying awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I had learned. I felt violated in a way that was hard to describe. When Daniel cheated on me, he had betrayed our marriage, but at least I could understand it as a weakness, as a failure of character, as something that happened because he was selfish and cruel. But what Caroline did felt different. It felt like a violation of something sacred, a corruption of the healing process itself. She had taken my pain and monetized it. She had taken my trust and weaponized it. She had sat across from me for months, nodding sympathetically, offering what seemed like genuine support, while secretly reporting everything I said to the man who had already destroyed my life once. The rage I felt was unlike anything I had experienced before. It was cold and focused, not the hot anger of discovering Daniel's affair, but something more dangerous. I wanted revenge. I wanted Caroline to pay for what she had done. I wanted her to lose everything the way she had tried to make me lose everything. But I also knew that I had to be careful. If I acted impulsively, if I lashed out without a plan, I might end up making things worse for myself. Caroline was a licensed professional with a good reputation. Daniel was a wealthy man with expensive lawyers. If I went public with accusations that I could not prove in court, they could turn the tables on me, accuse me of slander, make me look like a bitter, unstable woman who could not move on from her divorce. I needed to be strategic. I needed to plan my revenge carefully. And most importantly, I needed to make sure that when I struck back, the blow would be devastating and permanent. Rachel and I started meeting every evening to plan our next moves. Marcus continued to gather evidence, building a file that documented every payment from Beacon Consulting to Caroline, every connection between Daniel and the shell company, every piece of circumstantial evidence that pointed to a coordinated campaign against me. We also started researching the regulatory framework around therapy and professional licensing in Massachusetts. If I could prove that Caroline had violated patient confidentiality, she could face serious consequences. She could lose her license. She could be sued for malpractice. She could even face criminal charges depending on how the violations were characterized. The first step in my plan was to continue seeing Caroline while secretly recording our sessions. I knew that Massachusetts was a two-party consent state for recording conversations, which meant that recording her without her knowledge could be legally problematic. But I was not planning to use the recordings in court. I was planning to use them to gather more evidence of her inappropriate disclosures, to catch her in lies that I could later prove were false, to build a comprehensive record of her behavior that would support my complaints to the licensing board. If the recordings themselves were inadmissible, the information they contained could still guide my investigation and help me identify other sources of evidence that were legally obtained. So I bought a small voice recorder, the kind that fits in a pocket, and I started bringing it to every session. I would turn it on before entering Caroline's office and let it run for the entire hour. After each session, Rachel and I would listen to the recordings together, analyzing everything Caroline said, looking for inconsistencies and admissions that we could use. And we found plenty. We found Caroline asking leading questions that seemed designed to extract specific information, questions about my work performance, about my relationships with colleagues, about my plans for the future. We found her offering advice that seemed calculated to undermine my confidence, subtle suggestions that maybe I was not ready for partnership, that maybe I should consider stepping back from my career to focus on my mental health. We found moments where she seemed to be fishing for information about specific people in my life, people who just happened to be connected to Daniel's social circle. But the most damning discovery came about 3 weeks into our recording operation. I was listening to a session from the previous day when I heard Caroline's phone buzz in the background. She normally kept her phone on silent during sessions, but apparently she had forgotten this time. I heard her glance at it and saw her expression flicker before she quickly refocused on me. She said something dismissive like, "Sorry, just work stuff," and continued with the session. But I had noticed. And when I got home that night and reviewed the recording more carefully, I realized that her demeanor had shifted slightly after she saw that message. She had become more aggressive in her questioning, more focused on extracting specific details about my work situation. Marcus suggested that we try to get access to Caroline's phone records if possible. This was more difficult than tracking financial payments, but he had contacts who could sometimes obtain this kind of information through legal means, such as subpoenas in pending litigation. We were not at that stage yet, but we kept the option in mind for later. In the meantime, I continued to play the role of the trusting patient, feeding Caroline false information and documenting how quickly it spread through my networks. One of the fake stories I planted was particularly elaborate. I told Caroline that I had discovered my firm was being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission for potential insider trading violations. I said that I was worried about my own exposure, that I had been asked to provide documents to investigators, and that I was considering hiring a criminal defense attorney just in case. This was all completely false, of course. My firm had no SEC investigation, and I had done nothing wrong, but I wanted to see if this kind of sensitive, career-destroying information would make its way to Daniel. It took less than a week. I received a call from a partner at another law firm, a man named Richard, whom I had worked with on a few cases in the past. Richard said he had heard some troubling rumors about my firm and wanted to give me a heads up. He said people were whispering about an SEC investigation, and my name had come up in connection with it. He asked if I was okay, if I needed any help. I thanked him for his concern and assured him that I was fine, that there was no investigation, that the rumors were completely false. But inside, I was seething. Caroline had taken the lie I had told her in confidence and spread it through the legal community in Boston, potentially damaging not just my reputation, but my firm's reputation as well. This was beyond personal vendetta. This was professional sabotage that could have serious consequences for people who had nothing to do with my divorce. I had one more test I wanted to run before I moved forward with my formal complaints. I needed to prove that Caroline was in direct communication with Daniel, that the information was not just leaking through social networks, but was being deliberately transmitted to my ex-husband. Marcus had an idea for how to do this. He suggested that I tell Caroline something that would only matter to Daniel specifically, something that would prompt him to take immediate action if he learned about it. We spent several days brainstorming what this might be, and finally settled on a story about a hidden asset. In my next session with Caroline, I confided that I had recently discovered a bank account in my name that I had forgotten about. I said it was an old account from before the marriage, one that I had opened as a teenager and never closed. I said there was about $50,000 in it, money that had accumulated from an inheritance from my grandmother that I had never touched. I told Caroline that I was relieved the account had not come up during the divorce because Daniel would certainly have tried to claim half of it as marital property. I said I was planning to transfer the money to a new account so that Daniel could never find out about it. This was completely fabricated. There was no forgotten bank account, no inheritance from my grandmother, no $50,000. But I knew that if Daniel heard about this supposed hidden asset, he would react. He was a greedy man who felt entitled to every dollar he could get his hands on. If he believed I had concealed assets during the divorce, he might try to reopen the settlement, might contact his attorney, might take some kind of action that would prove he had received the information from Caroline. 4 days later, I received a letter from Daniel's divorce attorney. The letter claimed that Daniel had reason to believe I had failed to disclose certain assets during our divorce proceedings and that he was considering petitioning the court to reopen the settlement. The letter demanded that I provide documentation of all bank accounts in my name, including any accounts opened before the marriage, within 30 days. It was the proof I needed. The only person I had told about the fictional account was Carolyn, and Daniel had responded within a week with legal threats. There was no other explanation. Caroline was feeding information directly to my ex-husband, and she had been doing so systematically throughout our entire therapeutic relationship. I felt a grim satisfaction when I received that letter, not because I was happy about being threatened with legal action over an asset that did not exist, but because I finally had undeniable proof of Caroline's betrayal. I now had a clear chain of evidence, a lie I told in therapy, a response from Daniel that could only have come if he had learned about that lie, the financial records showing payments from a shell company to Caroline, the social connections between Caroline and Daniel's circle. It was a comprehensive case, and I was ready to start using it. The first person I contacted was the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Psychologists. I filed a formal complaint against Dr. Carolyn Vance, detailing the breaches of confidentiality I had documented over the past several months. I included the log of false information I had planted and how each piece had spread to people in my network. I included the financial records showing payments from Beacon Consulting. I included the letter from Daniel's attorney as evidence that my confidential disclosures had been transmitted directly to my ex-husband. I included a detailed timeline of my therapy with Caroline, showing how my professional and personal life had deteriorated during the period when she had access to my secrets. Filing that complaint felt like taking the first real step toward justice, but I knew it was only the beginning. Licensing board complaints can take months or even years to resolve, and there was no guarantee that the board would take decisive action. I needed to pursue other avenues as well, other ways to hold Caroline accountable, and to make sure she could never do to anyone else what she had done to me. Rachel suggested that I also consult with a lawyer about potential civil claims against Caroline. A malpractice suit could result in significant financial damages, especially given the harm that had been done to my career and reputation. I reached out to a colleague from law school who specialized in medical malpractice and asked if she could recommend someone with experience in psychology and mental health cases. She put me in touch with an attorney named Diana Ross, a sharp and experienced litigator who had won several high-profile cases against therapists who had violated their professional duties. When I met with Diana for the first time, I laid out the entire story from my initial decision to seek therapy after the divorce to the discovery of Caroline's payments from Daniel's shell company. Diana listened carefully, asked probing questions, and took extensive notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Megan, this is one of the most egregious cases of therapist misconduct I have ever encountered. What Dr. Vance did is not just unethical, it is a profound betrayal of everything the therapeutic relationship is supposed to represent. You have a strong case for malpractice, for breach of fiduciary duty, for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and potentially for conspiracy with your ex-husband to cause you harm. I think we can win significant damages, and more importantly, I think we can make sure this woman never practices therapy again." Hearing Diana say those words gave me a sense of validation I had been craving for months. For so long, I had felt alone in my suspicions, had doubted my own perceptions, had wondered if maybe I was being paranoid. Now I had a professional telling me that my instincts had been right all along, that Caroline had wronged me in ways that were legally actionable, and that there was a path to justice. I retained Diana immediately and authorized her to begin preparing the lawsuit. But there was one more thing I wanted to do before the legal process took over. I wanted to confront Caroline face to face. I wanted to look into her eyes and tell her that I knew what she had done. I wanted to see her reaction when she realized that her carefully constructed deception had been exposed. I knew Diana would probably advise against it, would tell me it was unwise to have any contact with Caroline outside the context of litigation. But this was personal. This was about closure. This was about reclaiming my power from the woman who had tried to take it from me. I scheduled one final therapy session with Caroline. I told her I had some important things I wanted to discuss, some breakthroughs I had experienced in my personal growth. She sounded pleased on the phone, completely unaware of what was coming. When I arrived at her office for that last appointment, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The anger was still there, but it was controlled now, channeled into purpose. I was not going to yell or cry or lose my composure. I was going to show her that she had underestimated me, that the vulnerable woman she had exploited had become something much more formidable. I sat down on the leather couch one last time and looked at Caroline across the coffee table. She smiled at me with that same warm, sympathetic expression she had always worn. She said, "It is good to see you, Megan. You mentioned on the phone that you have had some breakthroughs. I would love to hear about them." I nodded slowly and said, "Yes, I have. I have had a major breakthrough. Actually, I have finally figured out why my life has been falling apart for the past year. I have figured out why my professional reputation has been suffering, why people seem to know things about me that they should not know, why my ex-husband seems to be one step ahead of me at every turn." I paused for a moment, watching Caroline's face carefully, and the answer is sitting right across from me. Caroline's expression flickered. Just for a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating beneath the warmth. But she recovered quickly. She said, "I am not sure I understand what you mean. Are you feeling paranoid again? We have talked about this tendency of yours to see conspiracies where none exist." I smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting for this moment for a very long time. I said, "Nice try, Caroline, but I know everything. I know about the payments you have been receiving from Beacon Consulting. I know that is a shell company set up by my ex-husband. I know you have been feeding him information about everything I have told you in this room. I know you helped him try to destroy my career and my sanity. I know all of it." Caroline's face went pale. Her hands, which had been resting casually on her notepad, gripped the edges until her knuckles went white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. I continued. I said, "You probably thought you were clever. You probably thought I would never figure it out, that I would just keep coming here week after week, pouring out my secrets while you sold them to the highest bidder. But you made a mistake. You underestimated me. And now you're going to pay for what you did." Caroline finally found her voice. She said, "Megan, I do not know what you think you have discovered, but I assure you there is an explanation. Whatever you have been told, it is not what you think. Let us talk about this calmly. Let us not do anything rash." I stood up. I said, "There is nothing to talk about. I have filed a complaint with the licensing board. My attorney is preparing a civil lawsuit for malpractice and breach of fiduciary duty, and I have evidence of everything. The payments, the leaks, the connection to Daniel. You are finished, Carolyn. Your career is over, and everyone is going to know what kind of person you really are." I walked out of her office without looking back. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. From the sheer relief of finally saying what I had been holding inside for so long. I had taken back my power. I had shown her that she could not break me. Whatever happened next, I knew I had won this round. Part 2. The weeks that followed my confrontation with Caroline were a whirlwind of legal activity and emotional processing. Diana filed the civil lawsuit against Caroline within 10 days, and the complaint was thorough and devastating. It detailed every breach of confidentiality, every payment from Beacon Consulting, every piece of evidence we had gathered. The lawsuit named Caroline as the primary defendant, but also mentioned the shell company and its connections to Daniel, leaving the door open for expanding the case later if we uncovered additional evidence of his involvement. Carolyn hired a defense attorney, a man named Theodore Banks, who was known for aggressive tactics and high-profile clients. Banks filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that my allegations were based on speculation and that I had not proven any actual harm. Diana expected this and was prepared. She filed a detailed response with supporting documentation, including affidavits from people who had received leaked information about me, financial records from Marcus's investigation, and expert testimony about the standards of care for licensed therapists. The judge denied the motion to dismiss, ruling that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to discovery. Discovery is the phase of litigation where both sides exchange information and gather evidence. It can be brutal and invasive, but in this case, it worked in my favor. Diana was able to subpoena Caroline's financial records, her phone records, and her client files. We were careful to protect the privacy of her other clients, redacting any information that was not relevant to my case. But the records related to me and to the payments from Beacon Consulting were fully disclosed, and what we found confirmed everything we had suspected. Caroline's phone records showed dozens of text messages and phone calls to a number that was registered to Vanessa, Brittany's sister. The timing of these communications correlated directly with my therapy sessions. Caroline would see me on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning she would be on the phone with Vanessa. The content of the text messages was not always explicit, but there were enough references to me by name, to my work situation, and to things I had said in therapy to make the pattern undeniable. Caroline was using Vanessa as an intermediary to pass information to Daniel, probably to maintain plausible deniability and to keep her hands technically clean. The financial records were even more damning. Beacon Consulting had paid Caroline a total of $87,000 over the 18 months I had been her patient. The payments were labeled as consulting fees for professional development services, but there was no evidence that Caroline had ever provided any legitimate consulting services to anyone connected to the company. The money was pure bribery, payment for information about me that Daniel could use to undermine my career and my mental health. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was what we found in Caroline's notes about me. Therapists are required to keep detailed notes about their sessions, documenting the patient's condition, the topics discussed, and the treatment plan. Caroline's notes about me were unusually detailed, almost obsessive. She had written down things I had said almost verbatim, including specific names, dates, and amounts of money. She had highlighted information that seemed particularly sensitive or embarrassing. She had made annotations in the margins that said things like good leverage and useful for D, which I could only interpret as references to how the information could be used against me and to Daniel. Seeing those notes was one of the most painful experiences of my life. I had trusted this woman with my deepest vulnerabilities, and she had documented them not as a healer trying to help me, but as a predator cataloging her prey. Every moment of weakness I had shown, every fear I had confessed, every shameful secret I had revealed, she had captured it all and prepared it for delivery to my enemy. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I sometimes still have trouble believing it really happened. The licensing board moved faster than I expected. They assigned an investigator to my complaint, a retired psychologist named Dr. Harold Finch, who had spent his career studying professional ethics and had no tolerance for practitioners who violated their duties. Dr. Finch conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing me multiple times, reviewing all the evidence, and even reaching out to some of Caroline's other former patients to see if there were patterns of misconduct. What he found was shocking. I was not Caroline's only victim. Dr. Finch discovered at least 3 other former patients who had experienced suspicious leaks of confidential information after seeing Caroline. One was a woman going through a custody dispute who had found that her ex-husband seemed to know intimate details about her therapy sessions. Another was a businessman who had discussed trade secrets in therapy and later discovered that competitors seemed to have inside information about his company. A third was a young man struggling with addiction whose family seemed to know about relapses before he had told them. None of these patients had connected the leaks to Caroline because, like me, they trusted the sacred nature of the therapeutic relationship. But when Dr. Finch reached out to them and explained the investigation, they were willing to share their experiences. Caroline was not just betraying me. She was running a side business, selling confidential information to anyone who was willing to pay. How long she had been doing this, I will never know. But the pattern was clear. She had found a way to monetize her patients' secrets, and she had been doing it for years. The licensing board held a formal hearing about 6 months after I filed my complaint. Caroline was required to appear and respond to the charges against her. She hired Theodore Banks to represent her at the hearing, and he tried every tactic in the book to discredit me and the other witnesses. He suggested that we were disgruntled patients who were exaggerating our claims. He argued that the financial records were circumstantial and could be explained by legitimate consulting work. He even tried to suggest that I was mentally unstable and that my perception of events could not be trusted. But the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Finch presented his findings to the board, detailing the patterns of behavior he had uncovered. Diana submitted our civil case evidence as supporting documentation. The other former patients testified about their own experiences, and when Caroline herself was questioned, she could not provide coherent explanations for the payments she had received or the suspicious timing of her communications with Vanessa. She tried to maintain her composure, tried to project the same warm professionalism that had once fooled me so completely. But under pressure, the mask cracked. She became defensive, evasive, and at one point openly hostile toward the board members who were questioning her. The board deliberated for less than an hour before issuing its ruling. Dr. Caroline Vance's license to practice psychology in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was permanently revoked. She was found to have committed multiple serious violations of the professional code of ethics, including breach of confidentiality, exploitation of patients for personal gain, and failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The ruling also recommended that the board report her misconduct to licensing boards in other states where she held credentials, effectively ending her ability to practice therapy anywhere in the country. When I heard the ruling, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was not joy exactly. There was nothing joyful about any of this. But it was satisfaction, the knowledge that justice had been served, that Caroline would never be able to do to anyone else what she had done to me. She had lost everything she had built over 15 years of practice. Her reputation was destroyed. Her career was over. And everyone in the professional community would know exactly why. But the licensing board was just one front in my campaign for justice. The civil lawsuit was still pending, and I wanted Caroline to face financial consequences as well. Diana pushed aggressively for a trial, knowing that Caroline's legal team would probably try to settle rather than face a jury. And that is exactly what happened. About 2 months after the licensing hearing, Theodore Banks reached out to Diana with a settlement offer. Caroline was willing to pay a significant sum to make the case go away, to avoid the public spectacle of a trial that would further damage her reputation. Diana and I discussed the offer carefully. There were arguments on both sides. Settling would guarantee a certain outcome and would spare me the stress of a trial, but going to trial would create a public record of Caroline's misconduct and might result in even larger damages. I thought about it for several days and ultimately decided to settle. My main goal had already been achieved. Caroline had lost her license. she could not hurt anyone else. The money was secondary, but it would help me recover the financial stability that had been threatened by her betrayal. And honestly, I was tired. I had been fighting this battle for over a year, and I was ready for it to be over. The settlement was substantial. Caroline agreed to pay me $475,000 in damages, which covered my legal fees, the cost of Marcus's investigation, and compensation for the professional and emotional harm I had suffered. She also agreed to a non-disparagement clause, meaning she could not publicly criticize me or dispute the findings against her. In return, I agreed not to pursue any further legal action against her personally. The settlement was confidential in its specific terms, but the outcome of the licensing hearing was a matter of public record. Anyone who looked up Dr. Carolyn Vance would see that she had been stripped of her credentials for serious ethical violations. But my work was not done. There was still the matter of Daniel. He had been the mastermind behind this entire scheme, the one who had set up the shell company, the one who had paid Caroline for information, the one who had used my secrets to try to destroy my life, and he had not faced any consequences yet. The letter his attorney had sent demanding documentation about the non-existent bank account had been quietly withdrawn once it became clear that the information was fabricated. Daniel probably realized that his scheme had been exposed and was trying to lay low, hoping that I would be satisfied with taking down Caroline and would leave him alone. He was wrong. Diana and I began building a case against Daniel for his role in the conspiracy. This was more complicated than the case against Caroline because Daniel had been careful to maintain distance between himself and the actual payments. The shell company was designed specifically to obscure his involvement, but we had the phone records showing communication between Caroline and Vanessa. We had the social connections between Vanessa's husband Gregory and Daniel, and we had the suspicious timing of Daniel's legal threats correlating with information I had disclosed in therapy. Marcus continued his investigation, digging deeper into the financial trail. The breakthrough came when Marcus managed to obtain records from the bank that handled Beacon Consulting's accounts. The company had paid Caroline, but it had also received funds from somewhere. Marcus traced those funds to another company, which was traceable to a trust, which was ultimately funded by Daniel's personal accounts. The money trail was convoluted, but it was there. Daniel had paid for Caroline's betrayal, and we could prove it. Diana amended my civil case to add Daniel as a defendant. The amended complaint alleged conspiracy to commit breach of confidentiality, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with my professional relationships. Daniel's attorney filed motions to dismiss, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that Daniel had no direct involvement in Caroline's misconduct. But the judge allowed the case to proceed, noting that the financial trail raised serious questions about Daniel's role. Daniel did not want to go to trial. He had built a successful career in investment banking, and a public trial about his conspiracy to spy on his ex-wife through her therapist would be devastating for his reputation. His clients, his colleagues, his employers, none of them would want to be associated with someone who had done something so malicious and so bizarre. So his attorney approached Diana about a settlement before we even got to discovery. The negotiations were intense. Daniel's initial offers were insulting, barely covering my legal fees. But Diana knew how to play the game. She made it clear that we were prepared to go to trial, that we would subpoena every financial record Daniel had, that we would depose his girlfriend Brittany and her sister Vanessa and anyone else who might have knowledge of the scheme. She painted a vivid picture of the public spectacle that awaited Daniel if he did not settle on our terms, and gradually his offers increased. The final settlement with Daniel was even larger than the one with Carolyn. He agreed to pay me $650,000, bringing my total recovery to over $1 million. He also agreed to a permanent injunction prohibiting him from contacting me or attempting to gather information about me through any means. The settlement was confidential, but I made sure that the key people in Daniel's professional world learned enough about what had happened to damage his standing. Rachel helped with that, using her journalist contacts to plant stories about the lawsuit and the settlement in industry publications. The stories did not name Daniel directly, but anyone who knew the situation could connect the dots. Within a year, Daniel had left his position at the investment bank where he had worked for a decade. I heard through the grapevine that he had been forced out, that the partners did not want the liability of employing someone who might attract negative attention. Last I heard, he had moved to another city and was trying to rebuild his career somewhere no one knew his history. I do not know if he ever succeeded, and honestly, I do not care. He got what he deserved. The final piece of my revenge was more personal and more subtle. Throughout this entire ordeal, Brittany, the woman Daniel had cheated on me with, had remained in the background. She had not been directly involved in the conspiracy with Caroline, as far as I could tell, but she had benefited from it, had probably enjoyed hearing secrets about me that Daniel brought home from his spying operation, and she had built her relationship with Daniel on the wreckage of my marriage. I wanted her to understand that there were consequences for choosing a partner like Daniel, that the man she had stolen from me was capable of terrible things. I did not do anything dramatic. I did not confront her or threaten her or try to destroy her life the way they had tried to destroy mine, but I made sure that she learned the full truth about what Daniel had done. I had Rachel reach out to her through a mutual acquaintance, offering to share documents from the litigation that showed Daniel's involvement in the conspiracy. At first, Brittany refused to engage, but curiosity got the better of her, and eventually she agreed to meet with Rachel for coffee. Rachel showed her the financial records, the phone logs, the evidence of Daniel's payments to Carolyn. She explained how Daniel had used my therapist to spy on me, how he had tried to destroy my career and my sanity for no reason other than spite. Brittany sat in silence for a long time after Rachel finished speaking. Then she said, "I knew he was not a good person, but I did not know he was capable of this." Rachel told me later that Brittany looked genuinely shaken, that the information had clearly affected her deeply. I do not know what happened between Brittany and Daniel after that meeting, whether she confronted him, whether they broke up, whether she decided to stay with him despite everything. But I know that she could never again see him the same way. I know that she would always wonder what else he was capable of, what lies he might be telling her, what schemes he might be running behind her back. That knowledge, that permanent seed of doubt in her relationship, felt like justice to me. It has been almost 2 years since I confronted Caroline in her office. My life looks very different now. I did not get the partnership at my old firm. The damage to my reputation during the period when Caroline was leaking information was too severe, and by the time the truth came out, the opportunity had passed. But I found something better. I left the firm and started my own practice, specializing in helping other lawyers navigate career transitions and professional disputes. The settlement money gave me the financial cushion to take the risk, and my experience going through the legal system against Caroline and Daniel gave me unique insight into what clients facing similar challenges need. My practice has been successful beyond anything I expected. I have helped dozens of lawyers over the past 2 years, people who were pushed out of firms unfairly, people who faced discrimination or harassment, people who needed someone who understood both the legal and the emotional dimensions of professional crises. I built something from the ashes of what Caroline and Daniel tried to destroy, and I am prouder of it than I ever was of my position at the old firm. I also found a new therapist, someone recommended by Dr. Finch after the licensing hearing was over. Her name is Dr. Alicia Moreno, and she is everything Caroline pretended to be but was not. She is warm and empathetic, but also scrupulously ethical. She maintains clear boundaries. She never shares personal information about herself. She never asks leading questions or seems to be fishing for specific details. Being in therapy with someone you can actually trust after experiencing what I experienced is a profound gift. It has helped me process the trauma of Caroline's betrayal and move toward genuine healing. Rachel remains my best friend and closest confidant. Without her, I never would have uncovered the truth. Without her journalistic instincts, her willingness to investigate, her refusal to let me dismiss my own suspicions, I might still be seeing Caroline every week, pouring out my secrets to someone who was selling them to my enemies. Rachel was my partner in revenge, and she is now my partner in moving forward. We joke sometimes about writing a book together, about my experience and her investigation. Maybe someday we will. For now, we are content to enjoy our friendship and to celebrate how far we have both come. I think a lot about what I learned from this experience. I learned that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to repair. I learned that professional credentials and warm smiles mean nothing if the person behind them is rotten inside. I learned that the people we think are helping us can sometimes be the ones hurting us most. But I also learned that I am stronger than I ever knew. I survived a betrayal that would have destroyed most people. I fought back against enemies who had every advantage over me, and I won. There are days when I still feel the anger, when I still cannot believe what Caroline and Daniel did to me. But those days are fewer now. Mostly, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. I exposed the truth. I brought my enemies to justice. I rebuilt my life on my own terms, and I proved to myself and to everyone watching that you cannot break someone who refuses to stay broken. If you're listening to this and you have been betrayed by someone you trusted, I want you to know that there is a way through. It will not be easy. It will take time and courage and probably more strength than you think you have. But you have that strength. I promise you do. You can survive this. You can fight back. And you can win. Not because the universe owes you justice, but because you are willing to demand it. Because you refuse to be a victim. Because you know, deep in your bones, that the people who hurt you do not get to define how your story ends. My story ends with me sitting in my own office, in my own practice, looking out the window at a city that once felt like it was conspiring against me. It ends with me knowing who I am and what I am capable of. It ends with me at peace, not because everything is perfect, but because I fought for this peace and I earned it. My therapist turned into my enemy, and then I turned her into a cautionary tale. That is how my story ends, and I would not change a single chapter of it. The last time I saw Caroline was at the licensing hearing when the board announced their ruling. She looked small and diminished, nothing like the confident professional who had welcomed me into her office all those months ago. When the verdict was read, she did not react at first. She just sat there, staring straight ahead as if she could not believe what was happening. Then she turned and looked at me, just for a moment, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been hatred or might have been fear. I held her gaze without flinching. I wanted her to know that I was not afraid of her anymore. I wanted her to know that I had won. Then I got up and walked out of that hearing room, and I never looked back. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to Carolyn. After all, I destroyed her career. I took away everything she had spent years building. I exposed her to public shame and professional ruin. Is there not some part of me that feels sympathy, that wonders if I went too far? The answer is no. What Carolyn did was not a mistake. It was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate, calculated, ongoing scheme to profit from her patient's pain. She chose to betray people who trusted her absolutely. She chose to sell secrets that were meant to be sacred. She did not stumble into misconduct. She built a business around it, and she would have kept doing it forever if I had not stopped her. I am not the villain of this story. I am not even the hero, really. I am just someone who refused to accept injustice, who demanded accountability, who was willing to do what it took to protect myself and others. The people who suffer from betrayal are never the ones who chose the conflict. We are the ones who responded to it. And I responded with everything I had. Daniel is harder to talk about because my feelings about him are more complicated. He was my husband. I loved him once. I built a life with him, made plans for a future that we were supposed to share, and then he threw all of that away for an affair with a younger woman, and when that was not enough destruction, he conspired to destroy what was left of my life. Why? I still do not fully understand. Maybe he was afraid I would recover and become more successful than him. Maybe he wanted to keep me weak so I could never threaten him again. Maybe he is just cruel in a way that defies rational explanation. What I do know is that Daniel will never be able to hurt me again. The injunction ensures that. The damage to his reputation ensures that. And the knowledge that I beat him, that I exposed him, that I made him pay for what he did, ensures that every time he thinks of me, he will remember that I won. That is its own form of justice, one that will follow him for the rest of his life. As for Brittany, I genuinely do not care what happens to her. She was not the mastermind of any of this. She was just a woman who fell for a charming man without understanding what he was really like. Learning the truth about Daniel was probably punishment enough. Living with the knowledge of what he is capable of, wondering if he will someday do the same thing to her, that is a kind of prison she built for herself when she chose to stay with a man who cheated on his wife. I take no pleasure in her suffering, but I also take no responsibility for it. She made her choices, and she will live with the consequences. The last thing I want to say is this. What happened to me was not my fault. For a long time, I blamed myself. I thought I should have seen the signs with Daniel. I thought I should have been more careful about choosing a therapist. I thought there was something wrong with me that made me vulnerable to these predators. But that is not true. The fault lies entirely with the people who chose to betray me. I did nothing wrong by trusting my husband. I did nothing wrong by seeking therapy after my divorce. I was not naive or foolish or weak. I was a human being looking for connection and healing, and I was targeted by people who saw that as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. If you have been betrayed, please hear me when I say this. It is not your fault. You did not deserve what happened to you. You were not too trusting or too vulnerable or too anything. The people who hurt you are the ones who made the choice to cause harm. They are the ones who bear the moral responsibility. And while you may not be able to control what they did to you, you can control what happens next. You can choose to fight back. You can choose to demand justice. You can choose to rebuild on your own terms, with your own strength, according to your own values. That is what I did, and if I could do it, so can you. My name is Megan Holloway. I trusted my therapist with my deepest secrets, and she sold them to my ex-husband. And then I destroyed them both. This is my story, and I am at peace with every word of it.